Close your eyes. Let your breathing slow. Tonight we are going to travel the longest road the ancient world ever built. Not a road of stone and mortar, but a road of footsteps and camel pads and horse hooves and ship keels. A road that wound for 4,000 miles across the highest mountains and the driest deserts and the widest plains that the earth has to offer. Tonight we travel the Silk Road. It is not one road. That is the first thing to understand, and you can let it settle into you gently as you lie there in the dark. The Silk Road was never a single path that you could follow from beginning to end the way you might walk a lane between two towns. It was a network, a web, a braiding and rebraiding of routes across the vast interior of the Asian continent. Routes that connected the ancient civilization of China in the east to the civilizations of the Mediterranean in the west, and that along the way passed through Persia and Arabia and India and the great steppes of Central Asia and 100 cities whose names still carry the perfume of distance and mystery. Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, Merv, Dunhuang, Antioch. Along these roads moved silk, yes, the miraculous fabric that the Chinese had learned to produce from the cocoons of silkworms, a fabric so fine and so beautiful that the Western world would pay almost any price for it. But silk was only the most famous of the goods that traveled these routes. Along them also moved spices and glass and cotton and lapis lazuli and gold and horses and jade and porcelain and paper and gunpowder, and the bubonic plague and Buddhism and Islam and Christianity, and the mathematics of the Arabs, and the philosophy of the Greeks and the art of Persia, and 1,000 other things, visible and invisible, that made the medieval world what it was. The Silk Road was the internet of the ancient world, the system by which ideas and goods and people moved across vast distances and changed everything they touched. And its story is the story of human civilization itself, of the restless human desire to go further, to trade, to talk, to connect, to understand the world beyond the next mountain range. Let the story carry you now, slowly and gently, into the deep country of sleep. Chapter 1: The World Before the Silk Road. To understand the Silk Road, we must first understand the world it connected, and why those connections were so difficult and so desired. In the centuries before the Silk Road came into being, the great civilizations of the ancient world were separated from one another by distances that were, by the standards of the time, almost unimaginable. China, whose civilization had been developing for thousands of years in the river valleys of the Yellow River and the Yangtze, knew almost nothing of the civilizations to its west. The Mediterranean world of Greece and Rome knew almost nothing of China. The Persian Empire, sitting roughly in the middle, had contacts with both East and West, but served more as a barrier than a bridge. India was connected to both Persia and China through difficult mountain passes, but those connections were tenuous and fragile. The physical geography of Central Asia was the great obstacle. Between China and the Mediterranean lay the Pamir Mountains, the roof of the world, where peaks rise to 7,000 meters, and the passes are blocked by snow for much of the year. Beyond the Pamirs lay the Taklamakan Desert, one of the most hostile environments on Earth, a vast basin of shifting sand dunes where summer temperatures can reach 50 degrees Celsius, and where the Persian name for the desert, roughly translated as "you go in and you don't come out," was not an exaggeration. To the north of the desert lay the Tian Shan Mountains, whose name means celestial mountains, snow-capped and formidable. To the south lay the Kunlun Range, equally forbidding. And yet people crossed these landscapes. They had been crossing them, in small numbers and for local purposes, long before the Silk Road had a name or a concept. The nomadic peoples of the Central Asian steppes, the vast grasslands that stretched from Eastern Europe to Mongolia, moved constantly across these territories with their herds, and their movements created pathways and knowledge of the landscape that would eventually make the Silk Road possible. Oasis towns grew up at the edges of the deserts, wherever a mountain river brought water to the otherwise barren plains, and these oases became the stepping stones that made long-distance travel across the desert corridors survivable. The development of the horse and the camel as pack animals was essential. The Bactrian camel, the two-humped variety native to Central Asia, was perhaps the most important single animal in the history of the Silk Road. A Bactrian camel can carry up to 250 kilograms of goods. It can go for weeks without water by metabolizing the fat stored in its humps. Its wide, padded feet do not sink into sand. Its thick eyelashes and closable nostrils protect it against sandstorms. It can tolerate extremes of heat and cold that would kill most other pack animals. Without the Bactrian camel, the Silk Road as we know it could not have existed. Horses were equally important, particularly in the mountain passes where camels struggled. The horse cultures of the Central Asian steppes had been breeding exceptional horses for centuries, big, fast, strong animals that were far superior to the horses of China or the Mediterranean. The Chinese, in particular, coveted Central Asian horses for military purposes, and the desire for good horses would be one of the driving forces of Chinese expansion westward that helped create the Silk Road. So the geography was forbidding but not impossible. The animals were available if you knew how to use them. The oases were there if you knew where to find them. What was missing in the centuries before the Silk Road was the political will and the commercial incentive to organize long-distance trade on a systematic basis. That would change with the rise of two empires, one at each end of the ancient world, that were large enough and powerful enough to create the conditions under which long-distance trade could flourish. Chapter 2: The Han Dynasty and the Opening of the West. The story of the Silk Road's formal beginning is usually told as the story of a man named Zhang Qian, and it begins with a problem: horses. In the 2nd century BCE, China was governed by the Han Dynasty, one of the great imperial dynasties of Chinese history, whose rule would last for 400 years, and whose cultural legacy was so profound that the Chinese people still call themselves the Han people today. The Han emperors had inherited a vast empire from the Qin dynasty that preceded them, and they had expanded it further, pushing north and west against the nomadic peoples of the steppes. The most dangerous of these nomadic peoples were the Xiongnu, a confederation of tribes north of China's borders who were organized, militarily formidable, and perpetually threatening. The Xiongnu cavalry was superior to Chinese cavalry because they rode better horses. The Han emperors needed those horses, or horses like them. They had heard rumors from the western steppes of horses, so magnificent they were called heavenly horses, blood-sweating horses from the Fergana Valley in what is now Uzbekistan, and they wanted them. In 139 BCE, the Han Emperor Wudi sent an envoy named Zhang Qian westward into the unknown, with instructions to find the Yuezhi, a people who had been displaced westward by the Xiongnu, and propose a military alliance against their common enemy. It was a diplomatic mission, but it was also an exploratory one, because no Chinese official had ever traveled into the far west and returned with a systematic account of what was there. Zhang Qian's journey was one of the great adventures of the ancient world. He was captured almost immediately by the Xiongnu and held prisoner for 10 years. He escaped, continued his journey west, reached the Fergana Valley and Bactria and Sogdia, gathered intelligence about the kingdoms and peoples of Central Asia, and eventually returned to China 13 years after he had set out with his report. He had found not an alliance, but something perhaps more valuable, a systematic knowledge of the roots, the peoples, the cities, and the trade goods of Central Asia. His report to the emperor was revelatory. He described lands of remarkable fertility and rich cities and trade networks that China had never known existed. He mentioned that he had seen, in the markets of Bactria, Chinese goods, bamboo canes and cloth from the southern Chinese province of Sichuan, that had arrived there via India, a route China had never used. The world to China's west was not empty. It was full of peoples and possibilities. Zhang Qian's mission did not produce the military alliance the emperor had wanted, but it opened a door that would never fully close. In the following decades, the Han Dynasty began to push its power westward into Central Asia, establishing garrisons and administrative posts along the routes Zhang Qian had described, driving the Xiongnu northward and creating a corridor of relative safety through which trade could travel. Chinese silk began to flow westward in substantial quantities. Western goods, horses, glassware, grapes, alfalfa, pomegranates, began to arrive in China. The Silk Road had begun. It had begun not primarily as a road of commerce, though commerce would quickly become its most important function. It had begun as an instrument of imperial policy, a means by which the Han Empire could project its power, gather intelligence, and acquire the military resources it needed. But empires create the conditions for trade even when they do not intend to, because empires provide security, and security is what merchants need above all else. And so the merchants followed the soldiers and the diplomats. They were to begin with not Chinese but Sogdian traders from the cities of Sogdia, in what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, who had been operating commercial networks across Central Asia for centuries, and who proved perfectly positioned to serve as the middlemen of the new long-distance trade. The Sogdians were, in the history of the Silk Road, perhaps the most important single group of people, and we will meet them again. Chapter 3: Silk, the fabric that started everything. Let us pause here in the soft darkness and think about silk, about what it is and what it meant, and why it was worth crossing deserts and mountains to acquire. Silk is produced by the silkworm, the caterpillar of the moth Bombyx mawri, as it spins its cocoon. The silkworm feeds on mulberry leaves, and as it transforms from caterpillar to pupa, it spins around itself a continuous thread of protein fiber that may be as long as 900 meters in a single cocoon. That fiber, when unwound and woven, produces a fabric of extraordinary qualities, incredibly light, with a natural sheen that catches and reflects light in a way that no other natural fiber can match, warm in winter and cool in summer, strong despite its apparent delicacy, and capable of absorbing dyes in colors of remarkable brilliance. The Chinese had known how to produce silk for thousands of years. Legend attributes its discovery to the wife of the Yellow Emperor, a mythological figure said to have lived around 2700 BCE, who allegedly discovered the secret of the silkworm's thread when a cocoon fell into her teacup and she unwound it with her finger. The historical reality is that sericulture, the raising of silkworms and the production of silk, was practiced in China at least as far back as 3000 BCE, thousands of years before anyone else on Earth knew the secret. And it was a secret. The Chinese guarded the knowledge of silk production with extraordinary jealousy. The penalty for revealing the secret of the silkworm, for smuggling silkworm eggs or mulberry seeds out of China, was death. For centuries, the Western world received Chinese silk without any idea of where it came from. Some Roman writers believed it grew on trees, combed off leaves like a kind of vegetable wool. Others thought it was produced by a kind of giant spider. The actual truth, that it was spun by a caterpillar, was apparently too strange to guess. This information asymmetry, China knowing the secret of silk production while the rest of the world did not, was the fundamental economic fact that made the Silk Road possible. Chinese silk was absolutely unique. Nothing else in the ancient world looked like it or felt like it. In Rome, silk cloth was literally worth its weight in gold. Roman senators passed laws trying to ban men from wearing silk, not because they disapproved of the fabric, but because the drain of gold to the east in payment for silk was damaging the Roman economy. The laws were ignored. Silk was too beautiful to resist. The Chinese used silk not only as a luxury good for domestic consumption, but as a form of currency in their foreign relations. The Han Dynasty gave silk as diplomatic gifts to foreign rulers, used it to pay off nomadic peoples who might otherwise raid the frontiers, and traded it for the horses and other goods they needed from the West. Silk was simultaneously a commodity, a currency, and a symbol of Chinese civilization. The proof, as far as the Chinese were concerned, of the superiority of their culture over the barbarous peoples who could only desire but not produce it. The Roman desire for silk was almost pathological. Roman sources complain repeatedly about the trade deficit that silk imports created, about the gold flowing east to pay for an Eastern luxury. The Emperor Tiberius issued decrees against silk wearing that were widely flouted. The historian Pliny the Elder estimated that the Roman Empire was losing 100 million sesterces a year to Eastern trade, silk, spices, and other luxuries. A sum that was contributing, he argued, to Rome's moral and economic decline. Whether Pliny's numbers were accurate is questionable, but the underlying reality was not. Silk traveled westward from China in enormous quantities, passing through the hands of multiple middlemen along the way: Sogdian merchants, Parthian merchants, Arabian merchants, each taking their profit, so that by the time silk reached Rome it had already passed through perhaps a dozen sets of hands, and its price had multiplied many times over. A silk robe in Rome might cost more than a house. The secret of silk production finally leaked out of China in the 6th century CE, when two monks, allegedly Nestorian Christian missionaries, smuggled silkworm eggs out of China concealed in hollow walking sticks and brought them to the Byzantine Empire. Within a generation, the Byzantines were producing their own silk. But by then the Silk Road had been operating for 6 centuries, and silk was only one of 1,000 goods that traveled its length. Chapter 4. The Parthians, middlemen of the ancient world. Between China and Rome lay a succession of empires and kingdoms, each of which played its role in the Silk Road story. The most important of these, in the early centuries of the Silk Road's existence, was the Parthian Empire, a Persian successor state that controlled the territory of modern Iran and much of the Middle East from roughly 247 BCE to 224 CE. The Parthians were the essential middlemen. Every overland trade route from east to west passed through their territory. Every merchant traveling between China and Rome had to deal with the Parthians, pay them duties, obtain their permission, use their roads and their cities. The Parthians understood this perfectly and exploited it with great commercial skill. Their capital, Ctesiphon, on the Tigris River in what is now Iraq, became one of the great trading cities of the ancient world. Their great cities along the trade routes, Ecbatana, Seleucia, Merv, were cosmopolitan places where merchants from east and west could meet, trade, and rest before continuing their journeys. The Parthians had no interest in allowing direct trade between China and Rome if they could profit from being the intermediaries, and they successfully maintained their monopoly position for centuries. The Parthians' relationship with Rome was one of the defining geopolitical tensions of the ancient world. The two empires fought repeatedly for control of the Syrian frontier and the buffer kingdoms that lay between them. The Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE, in which a Roman army under the general Crassus was annihilated by Parthian forces, was one of the most traumatic military defeats in Roman history. 20,000 Romans killed, 10,000 captured, the golden eagle standards of 7 legions taken as trophies. According to one tradition, the captured Romans were sent east into Central Asia, where they eventually settled, and their descendants can still supposedly be detected in the facial features of certain Chinese villagers. A story that is probably legendary, but is too romantic to dismiss entirely. At Carrhae, the Romans had their first extended view of Parthian military equipment, and in particular of the silk banners and streamers that the Parthian cavalry carried. The Romans had seen silk before, but the sight of those brilliant banners in the sunlight, moving and shimmering with the wind, was reportedly overwhelming, a vision of luxury and color that the Romans had never encountered in such quantity. Whatever the historical accuracy of the account, it captures something real. Silk was a shock to the senses of people encountering it for the first time. The Parthians also maintained close relations with India, their southern neighbor. through which a sea route connected the Mediterranean world to the Indian Ocean trading network. The Parthian city of Characene, near the mouth of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, was a major entrepot where goods from the Indian Ocean trade were transferred to the overland routes northward. This connection between the sea routes and the land routes was crucial. The Silk Road was never purely a land route, but was always complemented by maritime connections. The Parthian Empire fell in 224 CE to a new Persian dynasty, the Sassanids, who would continue the Parthian role as middlemen between East and West for another 4 centuries, until the coming of Islam transformed the entire region. Chapter 5: The Roman Empire and the Desire for the East. At the western end of the Silk Road stood Rome, the Mediterranean world's most powerful empire, the largest political entity the Western world had ever seen, a city of 1 million people at its height, and an empire of perhaps 50 million, stretching from the Scottish Highlands to the sands of Egypt and the mountains of Mesopotamia. Rome's relationship with the Silk Road was primarily that of consumer. The Romans produced things the East wanted: gold and silver, glass, wool, but their hunger for Eastern goods was insatiable. They wanted silk and spices and incense, and precious stones and exotic animals and cotton and perfumes, and all the luxury goods that flowed westward along the trade routes. The Roman economy was wealthy enough to sustain this import trade, but the drain of gold eastward was a persistent source of anxiety for Roman writers and policymakers. The Roman city of Antioch, in what is now southern Turkey, was the great western terminus of the overland Silk Road, the point at which goods from the east entered the Roman world in the largest quantities. It was one of the most important cities of the ancient world, a metropolis of perhaps 500,000 people, cosmopolitan and rich, where merchants from across the known world rubbed shoulders in its famous colonnaded streets. The goods that arrived at Antioch from the east had already traveled thousands of miles, from Chinese workshops through Central Asian markets and Parthian territories and Syrian deserts, and their arrival transformed Antioch into a city of extraordinary luxury and diversity. Alexandria in Egypt was the other great western terminus. This one connected more to the sea routes of the Red Sea and Indian Ocean than to the overland routes. Alexandria was the intellectual capital of the ancient world, home to the great library, to the museum, to scholars and scientists and philosophers from across the Mediterranean. It was also one of the world's great commercial cities, where the products of the Indian Ocean trade, spices, silk that had come by sea, cotton, precious stones, arrived in the great harbor and were redistributed across the Mediterranean. Roman merchants did, occasionally, attempt to bypass the Parthian middlemen by sailing directly from Egypt to India. The discovery of the monsoon winds, the fact that the monsoon blows reliably toward India in summer and back toward Africa in winter, allowing merchants to make the round trip in a single year, made direct sea trade with India practical. The Greek navigator Hippalus is traditionally credited with the discovery of the monsoon route, though in reality it had probably been known to Arab sailors for centuries before the Romans learned of it. Roman goods have been found in archaeological contexts across India and even in what is now Vietnam, testimony to the reach of the Roman maritime trade network. Indian goods, pepper and other spices above all, flowed back to Rome in enormous quantities. The pepper trade was so important to Rome that, when the Visigoth chieftain Alaric besieged Rome in 408 CE, one of his demands was for 3,000 pounds of pepper as part of the ransom. Pepper was, in the ancient world, literally worth its weight in silver. Rome and China knew each other only vaguely, at enormous remove, filtered through the distorting lens of multiple intermediaries. Chinese sources refer to the Roman Empire as Dakin, the Great Qin, and describe it in terms that suggest genuine curiosity mixed with considerable confusion. Roman sources mention the seers, the Silk people, with wonder and some apprehension, placing them vaguely at the eastern edge of the world. Direct contact between the two empires was extremely rare. A Roman embassy is recorded in Chinese sources as arriving at the Han court in 166 CE, though whether these were genuine Roman representatives or Parthian merchants pretending to be Romans is debated by historians. Despite this mutual ignorance, the two empires were profoundly connected through the Silk Road's commerce. Roman gold paid for Chinese silk. Chinese silk clothed Roman senators. The economic relationship between the two ends of the ancient world was real and substantial, even if the two empires barely knew each other existed. Chapter 6. The Sogdians, Merchants of the Silk Road. If any single people can be called the people of the Silk Road, it is the Sogdians. They are not well known in the modern world. Sogdia was a small region of Central Asia, centered on the great cities of Samarkand and Bukhara in what is now Uzbekistan. But in the history of Silk Road commerce, they were absolutely central, the indispensable commercial community without which the whole system might never have achieved the scale and sophistication that it did. The Sogdians were Iranian-speaking people who had inhabited the oasis cities of Central Asia for centuries before the Silk Road began. They were not nomads, but city dwellers and farmers, people of the oases who had long experience of the trade routes connecting east and west through their homeland. When the Han Chinese expansion westward in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE created new opportunities for long-distance trade, the Sogdians were perfectly positioned to take advantage. They were brilliant merchants. Sogdian merchants established commercial colonies along the entire length of the Silk Road, in Chinese cities, in Parthian cities, in Indian cities, in Byzantine cities, creating a network of diaspora communities that could facilitate trade over vast distances. A Sogdian merchant in Dunhuang, the Chinese oasis town at the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, could send goods to a Sogdian merchant in Samarkand, who could pass them to a colleague in Merv, who could forward them to Constantinople. The chain of trusted commercial relationships that the Sogdian diaspora provided was the essential infrastructure of Silk Road trade. We know about the Sogdians from several remarkable sources. In 1907, the archaeologist Aurel Stein excavated a watchtower in the desert near Dunhuang and found a cache of letters that had been left there, apparently abandoned, around 313 CE. The letters were written in Sogdian by merchants stranded in China during the political chaos of the early 4th century, and they are among the most vivid documents we have from the ancient Silk Road. One letter, written by a merchant named Nanai Dihat, describes the catastrophic events in China, the sack of cities, the flight of the emperor, with the practical concern of a businessman whose trade routes have been disrupted. Another letter from a woman named Nanai Dhvan complains bitterly about her husband who has abandoned her and her daughter in the city of Dunhuang, while he has presumably gone off trading a remarkably human voice across 17 centuries. The Sogdians were cultural as well as commercial intermediaries. They carried not only silk and spices but also music, art, religion, and ideas. Sogdian art shows a remarkable blend of Persian, Greek, Indian, Chinese, and steppe nomadic elements, reflecting the position of Sogdia at the crossroads of civilizations. Sogdian musicians and dancers were famous across the Silk Road world. The Tang dynasty Chinese courts of the 7th and 8th centuries were particularly enthusiastic consumers of Sogdian music and dance, which was considered fashionably exotic. The Sogdians were religiously eclectic, as befitted a trading people who had to do business with peoples of many faiths. They practiced Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religion, as their primary faith, but Sogdian merchants in China adopted Buddhism. Sogdian merchants in the Byzantine Empire might adopt Christianity. The Sogdian diaspora communities were remarkably flexible about religion, adapting to local conditions while maintaining their commercial networks. The Sogdian language served as the lingua franca of the Silk Road for centuries, the language in which merchants from different backgrounds could communicate, negotiate, and write contracts. Sogdian script was the ancestor of several later scripts of Central Asia, including the Uyghur script and, through it, the Mongolian script. The linguistic legacy of the Sogdians thus spread far beyond their original homeland. The Sogdian commercial empire lasted from roughly the 1st century CE to the 8th century, when the Arab conquest of Central Asia disrupted their trade networks, and the Tang Chinese Empire's contraction reduced the Eastern demand for their services. The Arab merchants who replaced them as the dominant commercial force on the Silk Road were themselves extraordinary traders, but the Sogdian moment was over. Chapter 7. The Great Oasis Cities. The Silk Road ran through a series of oasis cities that were, in their heyday, among the most extraordinary places in the world. They were cities of water in a landscape of stone and sand, cities of trade and cosmopolitan culture at the edges of some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. Let us visit some of them tonight, in this quiet darkness, and let their names carry you gently towards sleep. Dunhuang was the last Chinese city before the Great Deserts. It sat at the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, the point at which caravans leaving China had to commit to the crossing, the last place to stock up on water and food, the last chance to turn back. It was also, by the same logic, the first place caravans arriving from the west would encounter the Chinese Empire. Dunhuang was a garrison town and a customs post, but it was also a place of remarkable cultural richness. Home to one of the great treasuries of Buddhist art in the world, the Magao Caves, where hundreds of cave temples carved out of the cliffs above the oasis were decorated with paintings and sculptures that accumulated over 1,000 years of pilgrimage and patronage. Kashgar was the great crossroads city at the western edge of the Taklamakan, the point at which the northern and southern routes around the desert converged before heading west into the Pamirs and then into Central Asia. Kashgar's famous Sunday market, still operating today, though transformed, was one of the great markets of the ancient and medieval world, a place where merchants from China and Central Asia and India and Persia met to trade horses and silk and cotton and spices, and everything else the Silk Road carried. The city was so well placed geographically that every empire that controlled Central Asia wanted to control Kashgar, and its history is a succession of conquerors: Chinese, Kushans, Turks, Arabs, Mongols. Samarkand was the queen of the Silk Road cities, the most beautiful, the most celebrated, the most desired. It sat in the fertile valley of the Zarafshan River in what is now Uzbekistan, an oasis of green and water in the semi-arid landscape of Central Asia, and it had been inhabited for at least 2,000 years before the Silk Road gave it its greatest glory. Alexander the Great conquered it in 329 BCE and called it Marikanda, and even that world-conquering general was reportedly struck by its beauty. The medieval traveler Ibn Battuta, who had seen almost everything the medieval world had to offer, called Samarkand one of the greatest cities in the world. In the 14th century, Samarkand became the capital of the Timurid Empire and was transformed by its ruler Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, into a city of breathtaking architectural ambition. The mosques and mausoleums and madrasas that Timur built, covered in blue and turquoise tilework that shimmered in the Central Asian sun, still stand today, still draw visitors from around the world. The Registan, the great central square of Samarkand, flanked by 3 monumental madrasas, is one of the most beautiful public spaces in the world, and standing in it in the early morning, when the light catches the blue tiles and the square is still quiet, it is possible to feel faintly the ghost of all the centuries of commerce and culture that flowed through this extraordinary city. Bukhara was Samarkand's great rival, another oasis city of the Zarafshan Valley, smaller but equally cosmopolitan. It was famous throughout the medieval world for its scholarship and its book trade. Bukhara's libraries were celebrated. Its madrasas produced some of the great scholars of the Islamic world, including the philosopher and physician Ibn Sina, known to the West as Avicenna, who was born nearby in 980 CE, and whose canon of medicine would serve as the standard medical textbook in both the Islamic world and Europe for centuries. Merv, in what is now Turkmenistan, was for centuries one of the largest cities in the world, a great oasis on the edge of the Karakum Desert, watered by the Murghab River, a city of 1 million people at its medieval height. It was a city of silk production, a city of scholarship, a city of religious diversity where Zoroastrians and Buddhists and Christians and later Muslims lived side by side. The Mongol destruction of Merv in 1221 was one of the great catastrophes of the medieval world. The Persian chronicles record that the Mongol general Talyui killed so many people that the bones lay unburied for years, and the whole region was reduced from a garden to a desert. Merv never recovered. These cities were not simply commercial waypoints. They were genuine civilizations, places where art and architecture and scholarship and music and religion flourished in ways that still astonish us. The Silk Road gave them their wealth and their cosmopolitan character, and when the trade routes shifted, the cities withered. But their legacy endured in the blue-tiled mosques of Samarkand, in the cave paintings of Dunhuang, in the manuscripts preserved in Bukhara, in the ruins of Merv. Chapter 8. The Kushan Empire and the World of Gandhara. Between China and Parthia lay one of the most remarkable civilizations of the ancient Silk Road world. The Kushan Empire, which flourished from roughly the 1st to the 4th century CE in the territories of modern Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northwestern India. The Kushans were the successors of the Bactrian Greeks, the extraordinary hybrid civilization that had been created by Alexander the Great's conquest of Central Asia in the 4th century BCE, and that had persisted long after Alexander's death. When the Kushan Tribal Confederation displaced the Bactrian Greek kingdoms in the 1st century BCE, they inherited a civilization that was already deeply blended. Greek artistic traditions, Persian political institutions, Indian religious ideas, Central Asian nomadic energy, all flowing together in the mountain valleys and river plains of what is now Afghanistan. The result, under Kushan patronage, was the civilization of Gandhara, one of the most creative and beautiful artistic cultures of the ancient world. Gandharan artists combined the figurative realism of Greek sculpture with the spiritual content of Buddhism to produce something genuinely new, the first images of the Buddha in human form. Before Gandhara, Buddhist art had represented the Buddha only symbolically, by a footprint, an empty throne, a wheel, a parasol. The idea of representing the Buddha as a human figure was apparently borrowed from Greek artistic tradition, which had long been comfortable with representing gods in human form. The resulting Gandharan sculptures, Buddhas with Greek facial features, wearing robes that fold in Hellenistic drapery, but sitting in the lotus position with the serene expression of enlightenment, are among the most beautiful religious sculptures ever produced. They would spread along the Silk Road from Afghanistan to China and Japan, transforming the visual language of Buddhism across the entire Eastern world. The Kushan Empire sat at the junction of 4 major trade routes: the overland Silk Road from China to the west, the route down through the Hindu Kush to the ports of the Indian Ocean, the route north into the Central Asian steppes, and the route west into Parthia and the Mediterranean world. This extraordinary position made the Kushans fabulously wealthy. They took a cut of every trade route that passed through their territory and allowed their art and culture to absorb influences from every direction simultaneously. The great Kushan city of Taxila, in what is now northwestern Pakistan, was one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the ancient world, a place where Greek and Indian and Persian cultures had been mixing for centuries. The Buddhist monasteries of the Kushan territories attracted pilgrims and scholars from across Asia, Chinese Buddhist monks traveling to India to obtain sacred texts passed through Kushan territory, and the great Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, who made his famous journey from China to India in the 7th century, described the Buddhist monuments of what had been Kushan territory with awe, even though the empire itself had already been gone for centuries. The Kushan contribution to the Silk Road story was not primarily commercial. Though the Kushans were certainly commercial, it was primarily cultural. They were the great transmitters of Buddhism to the East, the people through whose territory the religion traveled from its Indian homeland to the oases of Central Asia, and then to China and beyond. Without the Kushans and their hospitality to Buddhist missionaries and pilgrims, the story of how Buddhism became the dominant religion of Eastern Asia would have been very different. Chapter 9. Buddhism travels the Silk Road. Let us think in this quiet moment about how ideas travel. A thought forms in one mind in one place, and then moves through conversation, through writing, through art, through the accumulated teaching of generations to other minds in other places, and in moving, it changes. It absorbs elements of the new cultures it encounters. It sheds elements that cannot survive transplantation. And what arrives at the other end of its journey is both the same thought and a different one, transformed by the distance it has traveled. Buddhism's journey along the Silk Road is one of the great examples of this process. It is the story of how a religion born in the foothills of the Himalayas in the 5th century BCE became, 2,000 years later, the most widely practiced religion in Asia and one of the major spiritual traditions of the entire world. The Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, lived and taught in northeastern India in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. His teaching was about the nature of suffering and the path to liberation from it. His followers formed communities, monasteries, a tradition. For the first few centuries of its existence, Buddhism remained primarily an Indian religion, expanding within the subcontinent through the patronage of kings and the dedication of missionaries. Buddhism reached Central Asia through the Kushan Empire, as we have seen. But the critical moment for Buddhism's transmission to China came with the opening of the Silk Road. Chinese monks began to travel westward along the trade routes to visit the sacred sites of Buddhism in India and to obtain authentic copies of Buddhist scriptures. These journeys were extraordinary undertakings, months or years of travel through some of the world's most difficult terrain, through lands controlled by peoples of different languages and religions, with the constant dangers of bandits and disease, and the simple physical challenges of mountain passes and desert crossings. The greatest of these pilgrim travelers was Xuanzang, who set out from the Tang dynasty Chinese capital of Chang'an in 629 CE without imperial permission. The emperor had forbidden the journey and spent 17 years traveling to India, studying Buddhist texts, and returning to China with hundreds of manuscripts and relics. His account of his journey, the Great Tang Records on the Western Regions, is one of the great travel narratives of world literature and one of the most important primary sources for the history of Central Asia and India in the 7th century. His journey became the inspiration for one of the great novels of Chinese literature, the 16th century Journey to the West, in which the monk Tripitaka travels to India accompanied by the Monkey King and other supernatural companions. The Buddhist texts that travelers like Xuanzang brought back to China were translated into Chinese by teams of scholars working in monastery scriptoria, and these translations became the foundation of Chinese Buddhism, a form of the religion that adapted to Chinese culture, absorbed elements of Taoism and Confucianism, and produced schools and practices that were distinctively Chinese even as they maintained their Indian roots. Along the Silk Road itself, Buddhism left physical traces of extraordinary beauty. The cave temples of Dunhuang, carved out of the cliffs above the oasis and decorated over more than 1,000 years, preserve a record of Buddhist art in all its Silk Road diversity. Indian, Central Asian, Persian, and Chinese influences all mixed together in paintings of extraordinary richness and color. The giant Buddhas of Bamiyan, carved into a cliff face in Afghanistan in the 3rd and 5th centuries CE, destroyed by the Taliban in 2001, in an act of cultural vandalism that shocked the world, were among the largest Buddha statues ever made, visible for miles across the valley, testifying to the wealth and devotion of a Buddhist community at the crossroads of the Silk Road. Buddhism also traveled the maritime routes of the Silk Road, sailing from India to Southeast Asia and to China along the sea lanes of the Indian Ocean. The great Buddhist kingdoms of Southeast Asia, the Khmer Empire of Cambodia, the kingdoms of Java and Sumatra, were created by this maritime transmission. The Buddhist monastery of Nalanda in northeastern India was, at its height in the 7th and 8th centuries, one of the great universities of the ancient world, attracting students from China and Southeast Asia who had traveled thousands of miles to study there. The spread of Buddhism along the Silk Road was not without conflict or competition. The religion competed with Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, Nestorian Christianity, and eventually Islam for the souls and the patronage of the Silk Road world. It won some of those competitions and lost others, but it left behind, wherever it went, some of the most beautiful art and architecture in the world, a legacy of devotion and creativity that the Silk Road alone made possible. Chapter 10: The Sassanid Empire and the Persian Crossroads. In 224 CE, a Persian noble named Ardashir defeated the last Parthian king and established a new Persian empire, the Sassanid dynasty, which would rule Persia for more than 4 centuries until the Arab conquest of the 7th century. The Sassanids were, in many ways, the most important single empire in the history of the Silk Road. They controlled the central section of the overland routes for the longest period, and their cultural influence on the Silk Road world was profound and lasting. The Sassanids were proud heirs to the Persian imperial tradition, conscious of themselves as the successors of the Achaemenid Persians who had once ruled from Egypt to India, the largest empire the world had ever seen. They rebuilt Persian cultural identity around the Zoroastrian religion, making it the official state religion, and building fire temples across their territory as physical expressions of Persian civilizational identity. Their capital, Ctesiphon, near modern Baghdad, was one of the great cities of the ancient world. Its enormous throne hall, the Tak Kasra, with its vast single-span brick vault still partially standing today, testimony to the ambition and engineering skill of Sassanid builders. The Sassanids were sophisticated commercial operators who understood their position at the center of the Silk Road and managed it skillfully. They maintained close relationships with the Sogdian merchants who carried much of the trade through their territory. They themselves produced luxury goods of exceptional quality. Sassanid silk, glass, and silverware were prized across the Silk Road world and have been found in archaeological contexts from China to Britain. Their textile designs, the roundel patterns featuring fighting animals, hunting kings, and symmetrical birds of the so-called Senmerv or Simurgh, were so influential that they were copied by weavers from Byzantine Constantinople to Tang Dynasty China. Sassanid Persia was also a great cultural meeting place. The Persian court attracted scholars, artists, and religious thinkers from across the Silk Road world. When the Byzantine Emperor Justinian closed the Platonic Academy in Athens in 529 CE as part of his campaign against pagan philosophy, the philosophers of the academy traveled east to the Sassanid court of Khusro I, who welcomed them and who had a deep personal interest in Greek philosophy. The resulting intellectual exchange between Greek and Persian thought was significant and productive. The Sassanids were in constant military conflict with the Byzantine Empire to their west, a conflict that was simultaneously a military, religious, and commercial rivalry. The two empires fought a series of devastating wars across Syria, Anatolia, and Egypt in the late 6th and early 7th centuries that exhausted both of them and left both vulnerable to the explosive force that was about to emerge from the Arabian Peninsula: Islam. The Sassanid Empire fell with extraordinary speed to the Arab armies in the 630s and 640s CE. The last Sassanid king, Yazdijerd III, fled eastward before the advancing Arabs and was eventually murdered by his own servants near Merv in 651 CE. The empire that had lasted 4 centuries was gone in 20 years. But its cultural legacy endured in the Persian language and literature that would become the prestige culture of the Islamic world, in the artistic traditions that would be absorbed and transformed by Islamic art, in the administrative systems that the Arab conquerors adopted and adapted, and in the Zoroastrian communities that survived in Persia, and in the Indian diaspora of the Parsis, who fled to India rather than convert to Islam. Chapter 11. The Tang Dynasty, China's Golden Age of the Silk Road. If there is a golden age of the Silk Road, it is the period of the Tang Dynasty in China, from 618 to 907 CE. The Tang emperors created the most cosmopolitan civilization in Chinese history, a civilization that was genuinely open to the world in a way that China had rarely been before and would rarely be again. Their capital, Chang'an, modern Xi'an, was one of the great cities of the medieval world, a planned metropolis of perhaps 1 million people, where merchants and pilgrims and diplomats from across the Silk Road world gathered in numbers that made it the most internationally diverse city in Asia. Chang'an was organized on a grid of extraordinary regularity, an enormous square city with straight streets running north-south and east-west, dividing the city into wards that were locked at night. At the center was the Imperial Palace complex. At the periphery were the great markets, the East Market and the West Market, where merchants from every corner of the known world could be found. In the West Market of Tang Chang'an, you could buy silk from Chinese workshops and spices from Southeast Asia and glass from the Byzantine Empire and silver from Sassanid Persia and cotton from India and horses from Central Asia and 1,000 other things. You could hear 12 languages. You could find temples and shrines of half a dozen religions, Buddhist monasteries, Zoroastrian fire temples, Nestorian Christian churches, Manichaean shrines, and eventually mosques. The Tang emperors themselves were of mixed Chinese and nomadic steppe ancestry. The Tang imperial family had connections with the Xianbei, a Turkic people of the northern steppes, and this mixed heritage may have contributed to their relatively open attitude toward foreign cultures. The Tang court actively sought out Sogdian musicians and dancers. The Emperor Xuanzang was famously fond of Sogdian dance, particularly a spinning dance performed by Central Asian performers that resembled nothing in Chinese artistic tradition. Tang poetry is full of references to foreign music, foreign wine, foreign horses, foreign perfumes, all the exotic goods and sensations that the Silk Road brought to Chang'an. The Tang relationship with the Turkish cognates of Central Asia was complex and dynamic. The Turks, who had created a vast empire across the steppes from Mongolia to the Black Sea in the 6th century, were both trading partners and military threats. The Tang emperors maneuvered carefully between different Turkish factions, sometimes paying tribute, sometimes conquering, sometimes forming alliances. The great Tang Emperor Taizong was given the title Heavenly Khagan by the steppe peoples, as well as being the Son of Heaven by Chinese tradition, a remarkable duality that reflected the Tang dynasty's double identity, both Chinese and steppe. The Tang dynasty's control of the Silk Road reached its greatest extent in the 7th century, when Tang armies pushed westward through Central Asia all the way to the edge of the Sassanid, and then the early Islamic world. The Battle of Talas in 751 CE, in which a Tang army was defeated by an Abbasid Arab force in what is now Kyrgyzstan, is traditionally seen as the high-water mark of Chinese expansion westward, and also as one of the most consequential battles in history, because among the Tang prisoners taken at Talas were some who knew the Chinese secret of papermaking. The knowledge of paper production spread westward from there, reaching the Islamic world and eventually Europe, where it would transform communication and make the printing revolution possible. The Tang dynasty's decline in the late 8th and 9th centuries, following the devastating and Lushan rebellion of 755 CE, reduced Chinese power in Central Asia dramatically. The Silk Road did not end, but China's direct control of the western routes was lost, and the oasis cities passed under the control of the Tibetan Empire, the Uyghur Khaganate, and then a succession of other powers. Chapter 12: The Islamic Caliphates and the Transformation of the Silk Road. In 622 CE, a merchant from Mecca named Muhammad led his small community of followers north to the city of Medina, beginning the Hijra, the migration that marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. 10 years later, Muhammad was dead and his followers controlled the entire Arabian Peninsula. 30 years after that, they controlled Egypt, Syria, Persia, and much of Central Asia. Within a century of Muhammad's death, the Islamic Caliphate stretched from Spain to the borders of India and China, the largest empire the world had ever seen in terms of geographical extent. The Arab conquest transformed the Silk Road as completely as any event in its history. The middle section of the route, Persia, Mesopotamia, Syria, Central Asia, which had previously been divided among the Sassanid and Byzantine empires and various smaller kingdoms, was now unified under a single political authority speaking a single administrative language, Arabic. The Pax Islamica that the Caliphate provided, imperfect and contested as it was, made long-distance trade across this vast territory easier in important ways. A merchant traveling from the Persian Gulf to the markets of Spain was now, at least in theory, operating within a single legal and commercial framework. The Arab conquest of Central Asia brought the Islamic world into direct contact with the Silk Road's eastern trade for the first time. The Arab general Qutayba ibn Muslim conquered Samarkand and Bukhara in 712 CE, ending Sogdian political independence and beginning the process by which the population of Central Asia converted to Islam. The conversion was not instantaneous or always voluntary, but over the following centuries, Central Asia became one of the heartlands of Islamic civilization, Persian-speaking but Muslim, producing some of the greatest scholars and artists and poets of the medieval world. The Islamic world was an extraordinarily dynamic commercial civilization. Muhammad himself had been a merchant, and Islamic law and theology were generally favorable to commerce. The Prophet's hadith that the honest merchant would be raised on the day of judgment with the martyrs, and the saints reflected a genuine respect for trade that was unusual in the religious traditions of the time. Islamic commercial law was sophisticated and flexible, developing instruments like the Kamenda, a form of partnership in which one party provided capital and the other provided labor, sharing the profit, that facilitated long-distance trade in ways that were not available in other legal systems. Arab and Persian merchants replaced the Sogdians as the dominant commercial force on the Silk Road. They were not less capable. Arab dhows, the traditional sailing vessels of the Indian Ocean, were remarkably seaworthy craft, and Arab sailors used the monsoon winds with as much skill as anyone before them. The Arab geographic literature of the 9th and 10th centuries, works like Ibn Qordadbeh's Book of Roads and Kingdoms, Al-Masudi's Meadows of Gold, and Ibn Battuta's Travels, constitute the most detailed account of the Silk Road's routes and cities and peoples that we have from any period. The Islamic cities of the Silk Road became great centers of scholarship and science. Baghdad, founded in 762 CE as the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate on the Tigris River, became within a generation one of the great cities of the world, a planned circular city of perhaps 1 million people, the center of what historians have called the Islamic Golden Age. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad was a great translation and research institution where scholars translated Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic, and produced original works of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy that would eventually be transmitted to Europe and transform its intellectual life. the Algebra of Al-Khwarizmi, the Medical Encyclopedia of Avicenna, the Astronomical Tables of Al-Battani. All were products of the Islamic Golden Age that the Silk Road's commercial prosperity made possible. Chapter 13. The Maritime Silk Road. We have been traveling, so far, mostly along the land routes of the Silk Road. But there was another Silk Road, a maritime one, that ran along the coasts and across the open oceans of the Indian Ocean world. And in many periods of history, it was more important than the land routes. The Indian Ocean maritime trade network was ancient, much older than the overland Silk Road. Arab sailors and Indian merchants had been trading across the Arabian Sea for thousands of years before the Han Dynasty opened the overland routes to the west. The monsoon winds made Indian Ocean sailing both reliable and relatively fast. The summer monsoon blew from Africa and Arabia toward India and Southeast Asia, and the winter monsoon blew in the opposite direction, allowing merchants to make the round trip in a single year. The great ports of the maritime Silk Road were among the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan cities of the medieval world. Suraf, on the Persian Gulf, was the great entrepot of the Arab trade with India, a city that has been largely forgotten by history, but whose excavations have revealed a wealthy, sophisticated commercial civilization. Calicut on the Malabar coast of India was the great spice port, the source of pepper and cardamom and ginger, and all the spices that the Western world desired. Malacca, in what is now Malaysia, was the great crossroads of the Southeast Asian maritime trade, a city where merchants from India and China and Arabia and Java all met to exchange goods in what was, for a time, the greatest commercial city in Asia. China's role in the maritime Silk Road grew enormously from the Song dynasty onward, from the 10th century CE. Chinese merchants and sailors pushed south and west, establishing commercial networks that eventually connected Chinese ports to India, Arabia, and East Africa. The great Chinese junks, enormous wooden ships with multiple masts and watertight bulkhead compartments, far in advance of anything being built in Europe at the same time, could carry hundreds of tons of cargo. Chinese porcelain, which was produced in enormous quantities from the Song dynasty onward, became one of the dominant goods of the maritime trade. The blue and white ceramic that the Chinese called porcelain and that Europeans would not be able to reproduce for centuries. The great Sri Lankan port of Gala, the Indian ports of Calicut and Quilon, the East African ports of Kilwa and Mombasa, all of these were transformed by the maritime Silk Road into wealthy, cosmopolitan cities where Muslim Arab merchants, Hindu Indian traders, and Chinese merchants mixed and traded and occasionally settled permanently. The Swahili culture of East Africa is a product of this maritime mixing, a coastal civilization that combined African, Arab, and Indian elements into something distinctive and enduring. The most remarkable episode in Chinese maritime history was the series of great voyages made by the Admiral Zheng He in the early 15th century. Between 1405 and 1433, Zheng He led 7 massive expeditions into the Indian Ocean with fleets that were, by any standard, the largest the world had ever seen, fleets of hundreds of ships, including enormous treasure ships that dwarfed anything being built in Europe at the time, carrying thousands of soldiers and sailors. These voyages reached East Africa, Arabia, the Persian Gulf, India, Southeast Asia, and possibly beyond. Some historians have argued controversially that Zheng He's fleets may have reached the Americas before Columbus, though this remains unproven. Zheng He's voyages were not primarily commercial. They were diplomatic expeditions, projecting Chinese power and collecting tribute for the Ming Emperor. But they demonstrated the extraordinary capacity of Chinese maritime technology and organization. And then, after 1433, they stopped. The Ming court turned inward, banned the building of large ships, and China's great maritime adventure ended as suddenly as it had begun. Within decades, the Portuguese would round the Cape of Good Hope and enter the Indian Ocean, and the maritime Silk Road would be transformed into something very different. Chapter 14. The Spice Trade in the Perfumed World. No account of the Silk Road would be complete without the spices, the fragrant, flavored, medically valued substances that traveled the maritime routes from Southeast Asia and India to the tables and apothecaries of the Western world, and that drove the age of European exploration more powerfully than any other single commercial motive. Spices pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, mace, cardamom, ginger were among the most valuable commodities in the medieval world. The Western world consumed them in quantities that seem almost inconceivable today. Medieval European cooking used spices heavily, not merely as condiments but as preservatives, as medicines, as components of perfumes and incense, as symbols of luxury and status. A rich man's table was a spice table. The smell of pepper and cinnamon was the smell of wealth. And yet spices grew nowhere in Europe. Pepper came from the Malabar coast of India. Cinnamon came from Sri Lanka. Cloves and nutmeg came from the Banda Islands, a tiny archipelago in the eastern Indonesian Sea, so remote and obscure that most Europeans had no idea where they were. The distance between the Banda Islands and a merchant's counter in Venice or London or Antwerp was enormous, and every mile of that distance added cost. The spice trade was controlled in the medieval period by a succession of commercial intermediaries: Arab merchants who controlled the Indian Ocean routes, Egyptian merchants who controlled the Red Sea connection, Venetian merchants who controlled the Mediterranean end of the chain. Every intermediary took a profit. By the time a pound of pepper from the Malabar coast reached a London market, its price had multiplied many times over. The margins on spice trade were so enormous that a single successful voyage to the Spice Island could make a merchant wealthy for life. This was the commercial reality behind the age of exploration. When the Portuguese set out to find a sea route to the Spice Islands that bypassed the Arab and Venetian middlemen, they were driven not by pure curiosity or the desire for adventure, but by the cold calculation of commercial opportunity. The potential rewards were too enormous to ignore. Vasco da Gama's arrival in Calicut in 1498, after rounding the Cape of Good Hope, was the moment that began the transformation of the maritime Silk Road. Portuguese warships, armed with cannon far superior to anything the Arab dhows carried, could enforce their commercial demands militarily. Within a generation, Portugal had seized control of key strategic points around the Indian Ocean: Hormuz at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, Aden at the entrance to the Red Sea, Malacca at the entrance to the South China Sea, and was trying, imperfectly but determinedly, to monopolize the spice trade. The Portuguese never fully succeeded. The Arab merchants found ways around Portuguese control. The Ottoman Empire, which had conquered Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean in the early 16th century, competed with Portugal for control of the Indian Ocean trade. But the age of European involvement in the maritime Silk Road had begun, and over the following centuries, it would transform the trade routes beyond recognition. Chapter 15. The Mongol Empire and the Pax Mongolica. In the early 13th century, a force erupted from the steppes of Mongolia that would, within a generation, destroy more of the civilized world than any other military force in history, and then, paradoxically, create the conditions for the Silk Road's greatest flourishing. Genghis Khan was born around 1162, the son of a minor Mongol chieftain, and spent his youth in poverty and danger in the violent, fractured world of the Mongolian steppe. Through a combination of extraordinary military genius, ruthless political cunning, and sheer force of will, he united the warring Mongol tribes under his authority and began the conquests that would eventually create the largest contiguous land empire in history. The Mongol conquests were catastrophic for the civilizations they struck. The destruction of the great Islamic cities of Central Asia, Merv, Nishapur, Samarkand, Bukhara, was one of the great catastrophes of world history. The chronicles describe cities that had been flourishing metropolises reduced to rubble, their populations massacred or enslaved, their irrigation systems destroyed, their libraries burned. The Persian historian Juvayni, writing shortly after the Mongol conquest, described the destruction with a grief that is still palpable across 8 centuries. Cities that had been gardens becoming deserts, populations that had been millions reduced to thousands. The Mongol conquest of the Abbasid Caliphate in 1258 was perhaps the most symbolically devastating moment. The Caliph, the spiritual leader of Sunni Islam, was captured and executed, rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses, according to tradition, so that his royal blood would not touch the ground. The great library of Baghdad was destroyed. The House of Wisdom was gone. And yet, within a generation of the initial conquest, the Mongol Empire had stabilized into 4 successor khanates, each ruled by a descendant of Genghis Khan, and across the vast territory they controlled, from China to Persia to Russia, trade began to flow again with an ease and a security that had never existed before. This was the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. For roughly a century, from the mid-13th to the mid-14th century, the Silk Road ran through a single political entity. A merchant could travel from China to the Mediterranean without crossing a hostile border, without having to negotiate with multiple competing powers, without the constant danger of seizure or robbery by local authorities. The Mongols were genuinely enthusiastic about trade. They needed the revenues it produced, and they had no tradition of despising commerce. And they actively protected merchants and maintained the roads and relay stations that made long-distance travel possible. The results were extraordinary. For the first time in history, sustained direct contact between China and Europe became possible. Marco Polo's famous journey to the court of Kublai Khan in the 1270s was possible only because the Mongol Empire had made the overland route safe for travelers. His book, The Travels of Marco Polo, written after his return to Venice, was the first systematic account of China that the European world had ever had, and it transformed European understanding of the East and European desire for the goods that the East could provide. Marco Polo was not the only European to make this journey. The Franciscan friar Giovanni de Payan del Carpine traveled to the Mongol capital of Karakorum in 1245, the first European emissary to the Mongol court. William of Rubruck made the same journey in 1253. The Polos, Marco's father Niccolo and uncle Maffei, had already made one journey to the Mongol court before Marco accompanied them on the famous second journey. All of these travelers left accounts that transformed the European image of the Asian world. The Pax Mongolica also transmitted the plague, the Black Death of the 14th century, the bubonic plague that killed between a third and half of Europe's population in the late 1340s, traveled along the Silk Road. Its origins were probably in Central Asia or China, and it moved westward through the trade networks, carried by fleas on rats on the grain ships and caravan animals of the Silk Road. The Mongol world's openness to trade was also its openness to disease, and the consequences were catastrophic. The Mongol Empire fragmented in the mid-14th century, and with its fragmentation, the safety of the overland Silk Road disappeared. The routes became dangerous again. The Pax Mongolica was over. Chapter 16. Marco Polo and the European Discovery of the East. Marco Polo left Venice in 1271 at the age of 17, accompanying his father and uncle on a journey that would last 24 years and take him to places no European had ever described. He returned to Venice in 1295, having spent 17 years at the court of Kublai Khan, the Mongol Emperor of China, and having traveled across a China that was, in its wealth and sophistication and sheer size, almost incomprehensible to the European mind. His book, Il Milione, known in English as The Travels of Marco Polo, was dictated in a Genoese prison to a writer named Rustichello de Pisa. after Marco was captured during a naval battle between Venice and Genoa. The circumstances of its composition, a Venetian merchant dictating to a Romance writer in a prison cell, helped shape its character. It was both a geographical and commercial handbook and a book of wonders, full of descriptions of astonishing places and remarkable peoples and incredible riches. Marco described China, which he called Cathay, with a precision and a detail that left European readers simultaneously fascinated and incredulous. He described the paper money that the Mongol emperor used, a concept so alien to the medieval European understanding of money, which was based entirely on coin, that many readers simply didn't believe it. He described the coal that the Chinese burned for fuel, another thing that Europeans couldn't believe, since they had no equivalent. He described the enormous cities of China, the sophisticated postal relay system, the paper money, the elaborate bureaucracy, the vast wealth of the imperial court. Many of his contemporaries called him a liar. The book's Italian title, Il Milione, was supposedly a mocking reference to his habit of talking in millions, millions of people, millions of ducats, millions of everything. Even today, some historians question the accuracy of some of his descriptions and argue about whether he actually reached China or compiled his account from second-hand sources. But the broad outlines of his account have been confirmed by historical and archaeological research, and whatever its inaccuracies, The Travels of Marco Polo was the most important book about Asia that the European Middle Ages produced. The book's commercial content was particularly significant. Marco Polo described, with the trained eye of a merchant's son, the goods that China and Asia could offer: silk, spices, porcelain, precious stones, and the routes by which they could be obtained. His descriptions of the wealth of the Mongol court and the prosperity of the great Chinese cities fired the European commercial imagination in ways that would eventually lead to the voyages of exploration of the 15th and 16th centuries. Christopher Columbus, setting out in 1492 to find a sea route to Asia, carried a copy of Marco Polo's book with him, with his own annotations in the margins. The travels also sparked a literary and cartographic tradition. Medieval European Mappi Mundi, world maps, began to include the places Marco Polo had described. The Fra Mauro world map of 1450, the most accurate world map produced in medieval Europe before the age of exploration, drew heavily on Marco Polo's account of Asia. The image of Asia that formed in the European mind in the 14th and 15th centuries was, more than any other single source, the image that Marco Polo had painted. Chapter 17: The Black Death and the Silk Road. In the autumn of 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships arrived in the port of Messina in Sicily, carrying a cargo of goods from the east and something else, something invisible and terrible. The sailors on the ships were dying. Those who had not yet died were covered with black swellings at the armpits and groin, swellings that oozed blood and pus. People who came near the ships sickened and died within days. The Sicilian authorities ordered the ships out of port immediately, but it was too late. The plague was already ashore. Within months, it had spread to mainland Italy. Within years, it had swept across Europe from the Mediterranean to the Arctic Circle, killing between a third and a half of the entire population of Europe, somewhere between 25 and 50 million people. The Black Death was bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted by the bites of fleas that lived on rats and other rodents. It had originated, most historians now believe, somewhere in Central Asia, possibly in the region around Lake Issyk-Kul in what is now Kyrgyzstan, where a Nestorian Christian cemetery of the early 1340s shows a sudden spike in burials with inscriptions mentioning plague as the cause of death. From Central Asia, the plague moved westward along the Silk Road. It reached the Crimea, the great commercial hub at the northern end of the Black Sea, where Genoese and Venetian merchants traded with the Mongol world, in 1346. There are accounts of Mongol forces besieging the Genoese trading post of Kaffa on the Crimean coast and catapulting plague-infected corpses over the walls, one of the earliest recorded instances of biological warfare. The Genoese ships that fled Kaffa in 1347 carried the plague to Messina, and from there to the rest of Europe. The Black Death was, in one sense, a product of the Silk Road, of the connections that the Silk Road had created between distant parts of the world, allowing a disease that had been endemic in Central Asian rodent populations to reach, for the first time, the immunologically naive populations of Europe. The Pax Mongolica had made the Silk Road safer for merchants and pilgrims, but it had also made it safer for pathogens. The plague's consequences were enormous and long-lasting. In Europe, it killed so many people that the social and economic structure of medieval society was fundamentally altered. The shortage of labor that followed the massive death toll gave peasants and workers new bargaining power that they had never had before, accelerating the end of serfdom and the development of a more market-oriented economy. The psychological consequences were equally profound. The intimate and overwhelming encounter with mass death on a scale that dwarfed anything in living memory challenged the assumptions of both Christian theology and classical philosophy. In the Islamic world, the plague was equally devastating. Egypt, Syria, and other parts of the Middle East were hit as hard as Europe. The plague disrupted the overland trade routes of the Silk Road and weakened the great commercial cities through which the trade flowed. And in China, the plague, or something very like it, had already caused enormous devastation in the decades before it reached Europe. The population of China fell dramatically in the mid-14th century, and while plague was not the only cause, civil war and the decline of the Mongol Yuan dynasty also played roles. It was certainly a major factor. The Black Death was a reminder that the connections that the Silk Road created were double-edged. They brought wealth and cultural exchange, and the movement of ideas that enriched civilization. They also brought disease and destruction. The Silk Road connected the world, but connection has costs. Chapter 18: Timur and the Last Great Central Asian Empire. In the second half of the 14th century, as the Mongol Empire fragmented and the plague devastated the populations of Asia and Europe, a new conqueror arose from the ruins of the Mongol world. His name was Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, a corruption of the Persian Timur-Leng, Timur the Lame, a reference to the injuries he had received in early battles that left him with a permanent limp. Timur was born in 1336 near Samarkand, into a Turco-Mongolian noble family. He grew up in the chaotic aftermath of the Mongol fragmentation, when Central Asia was divided among competing rulers and military strongmen. By the 1370s, he had consolidated his control over the Chagatai Khanate, the Mongol successor state centered on Central Asia, and had begun the campaigns of conquest that would eventually make him the most powerful ruler in Asia. Timur's conquests were, if anything, even more destructive than those of Genghis Khan. He sacked Delhi in 1398, massacring its population and leaving the city in ruins. He defeated the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid at the Battle of Ankara in 1402 and captured him, reportedly keeping him in a golden cage, though this detail may be legendary. He sacked Baghdad again and killed its population, building pyramids of skulls outside the city walls in his characteristic fashion. And yet Timur was also a great patron of art and architecture. His capital, Samarkand, he transformed into one of the most beautiful cities in the world, building the great mosques and madrasas whose blue-tiled domes still draw visitors from around the world. He collected craftsmen and scholars from the cities he conquered and brought them to Samarkand, making his capital a center of art and learning as well as power. The Timurid dynasty that Timur founded lasted after his death in 1405, and the century of Timurid rule that followed, centered in Samarkand and then in Herat, was one of the great periods of Persian cultural achievement. Timurid architecture is among the most beautiful in the world. Timurid manuscript painting, the miniature tradition that would influence both Ottoman Turkish and Mughal Indian art, is of extraordinary refinement. The Timurid court was a center of scholarship in mathematics, astronomy, and poetry. But the Timurid Empire, like all the empires that preceded it in Central Asia, was fragile. Its unity depended on the personality of its ruler, its wealth on the continued flow of Silk Road trade. As the 15th century progressed, the trade routes began to shift. The Portuguese opening of the sea route around Africa and the consequent disruption of the overland trade would eventually drain the commercial lifeblood from the Central Asian oasis cities. The great Timurid cities would survive, physically, but their commercial importance would fade. Chapter 19: The Ottoman Empire and the Silk Road's Western End. In 1453, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II conquered Constantinople, ending the Byzantine Empire and adding one of the great cities of the world to his own. The conquest was a military and political earthquake whose reverberations would be felt across Europe for a century. It also had profound implications for the Silk Road. The Ottoman Empire, at its height, controlled the western end of the overland Silk Road, Anatolia, Syria, Egypt, and the routes through the Middle East. The Ottomans were themselves deeply embedded in the commercial networks of the Silk Road world. Ottoman merchants were active across the eastern Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and the Red Sea. Ottoman silk production, particularly in the great textile workshops of Bursa, was world famous. The Ottoman economy was both a producer and a consumer of Silk Road goods. The relationship between the Ottomans and European powers over the Silk Road's western terminus was complex. European merchants, primarily Venetians and Genoese, had long operated trading posts in the Byzantine and Crusader territories of the eastern Mediterranean, giving them privileged access to the goods of the Silk Road. The Ottoman conquest of these territories disrupted, but did not destroy these commercial relationships. The Ottomans needed European trade as much as the Europeans needed Ottoman trade, and a series of commercial agreements, the capitulations, gave European merchants trading rights within the Ottoman Empire. But the relationship was competitive as well as cooperative. The Ottoman Empire competed with Portugal for control of the spice trade through the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. When Vasco da Gama reached India by sea in 1498, the Ottoman authorities recognized the threat immediately. A sea route that bypassed Ottoman territory would divert enormous revenues away from the empire. The Ottomans tried to counter the Portuguese by sending naval forces into the Indian Ocean in the early 16th century, with limited success. The persistent Ottoman-European competition for control of the eastern trade routes was one of the driving forces behind European exploration. The desire to find trade routes to Asia that bypassed the Ottoman middlemen, to reach the spice islands of Southeast Asia and the silk markets of China without going through Ottoman territory, was one of the most powerful commercial incentives behind the great voyages of the 15th and 16th centuries. The Ottoman silk industry deserves special mention. The great Ottoman textile workshops produced silks of extraordinary quality. The famous Ottoman velvets and brocades, decorated with the tulip and carnation motifs that became the hallmarks of Ottoman decorative art, were among the most prized luxury goods in both the Eastern and Western markets. Ottoman silk traveled westward to the courts of Europe and eastward to the markets of Persia and India. The Ottoman Empire was not just a transit point for the Silk Road, but a creative participant in its commercial and cultural exchange. Chapter 20: The Silk Road and the Spread of Ideas. We have spoken of silk and spices and gold, of armies and empires and merchants, but the most important things that traveled the Silk Road were not material things. They were ideas. Mathematics traveled the Silk Road. The numeral system we use today, the so-called Hindu-Arabic numerals, was developed in India and transmitted westward through the Islamic world, reaching Europe in the medieval period. The zero, perhaps the most important mathematical concept ever devised, was an Indian invention that traveled west. Algebra, trigonometry, and the sophisticated astronomical mathematics that made navigation possible, all developed in the Islamic world and transmitted to Europe along the intellectual routes of the Silk Road. Without these mathematical tools, the age of exploration that transformed the world in the 15th and 16th centuries could not have happened. Paper traveled the Silk Road. The Chinese invention of paper, the lightweight, flexible, cheap writing surface that revolutionized communication and record-keeping, spread westward through the Islamic world after the Battle of Talas in 751 CE, reaching the Arab world and eventually Europe. Before paper, European scribes wrote on parchment treated animal skin, which was expensive and limited in supply. Paper made writing cheap and communication accessible in a way that had never been possible before, and eventually it made the printing press viable. Printing itself traveled the Silk Road, or at least the idea of it did. Woodblock printing was invented in China and was being practiced in China and Korea centuries before Gutenberg developed movable type printing in Europe in the 15th century. The connection between East Asian printing traditions and European printing is debated, but it is at least possible that knowledge of East Asian printing techniques, transmitted through the Silk Road world, contributed to the European printing revolution. Gunpowder traveled the Silk Road. The Chinese invention of gunpowder, developed in the 9th century CE as a result of alchemical experiments, spread westward through the Mongol world and reached the Islamic world and then Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries. The military consequences of this transmission were enormous. The gunpowder weapons that transformed warfare in late medieval and early modern Europe were built on a Chinese discovery. Astronomy traveled the Silk Road. The sophisticated astronomical knowledge of the Islamic world, built on Indian and Greek foundations and refined through centuries of careful observation, was transmitted to Europe through Spain and Sicily, where Arabic texts were translated into Latin. The astronomical tables, the understanding of planetary motion, the instruments like the astrolabe, all of these tools that European navigators used to explore the world were of Islamic origin, transmitted through the intellectual pathways of the Silk Road world. Religion traveled the Silk Road as we have seen. Buddhism, Christianity in its Nestorian form, Manichaeism, Islam, Zoroastrianism, all spread along the trade routes. The remarkable religious diversity of the Silk Road world. The fact that in a single Central Asian city you might find Buddhist monasteries, Zoroastrian fire temples, Nestorian Christian churches, Manichaean shrines, and eventually mosques all within walking distance of each other, was a product of the commercial openness that the Silk Road required and promoted. Music traveled the Silk Road. The lute, the ancestor of the guitar, was an instrument of Central Asian origin. The word lute comes from the Arabic al-ud, which itself may derive from Persian or Central Asian roots. The influence of Arab and Persian musical theory on the development of European music in the medieval and early modern period was significant, transmitted through the Arab presence in Spain and Sicily. The musical instruments, the scales, the musical theory that underlie the Western classical tradition are in part products of the Silk Road's cultural exchange. Chapter 21. The Silk Road in China's Han and Tang Art. The Silk Road left its mark on art as deeply as on any other aspect of civilization. The artistic exchanges that it facilitated were among the most creative and productive in human history, producing art forms that were genuinely hybrid, drawing on the traditions of multiple civilizations simultaneously. And that could not have been produced in any single, isolated cultural context. Chinese art of the Han and Tang periods shows the influence of the Silk Road clearly. Han Dynasty bronze vessels incorporate the animal art styles of the Central Asian steppes. Tang Dynasty grave figurines. The lively ceramic figures of horses and camels and Central Asian musicians and dancers that fill museum collections around the world reflect the cosmopolitan world of Chang'an, where Sogdian musicians and Bactrian camels and Central Asian horses were all part of everyday experience. The Flying Horse of Gansu, the famous Bronze Han Dynasty sculpture of a horse galloping with one hoof resting on a swallow, shows the influence of the heavenly horse tradition of Central Asia that the Han emperors so desired. The cave paintings of Dunhuang, the Mogao Caves, are perhaps the richest single repository of Silk Road art in existence. Over 1,000 years of painting, accumulated in 492 surviving caves, the artists of Dunhuang created a visual record of the Silk Road world that is unparalleled. You can see, in the Dunhuang paintings, Indian Buddhist imagery rendered in Chinese style, Persian decorative motifs combined with Chinese landscape painting, Central Asian faces and dress mixed with Chinese artistic conventions. The paintings are simultaneously a record of Buddhist devotion and a visual encyclopedia of the Silk Road's cultural exchanges. Persian and Central Asian art also shows the influence of the Silk Road deeply. The Sogdian palace paintings of Afrasiab, the ancient city beneath Samarkand, whose remarkable frescoes were discovered in the 1960s, show a world of diplomatic exchange and courtly ceremony in which Chinese, Indian, Byzantine, and Sogdian figures all appear. The paintings were made in the 7th century CE and depict the cosmopolitan world of the Silk Road at its Tang dynasty peak. The Sassanid Persian silverware that traveled along the Silk Road is among the most beautiful metalwork of the ancient world. Sassanid silver plates, showing hunting kings, feasting nobles, mythological scenes, have been found across an enormous geographical range, from China to Eastern Europe, testimony to the prestige of Persian luxury goods and the reach of the trade networks that carried them. The imagery of these plates, the hunting king, the symmetrical birds flanking a central tree, became part of the shared visual vocabulary of the Silk Road world, appearing in Chinese bronze mirrors, Central Asian textiles, and Byzantine ivory carvings. Islamic art, which developed from the 7th century onward, drew on the entire artistic heritage of the Silk Road world. Persian decorative traditions, Byzantine mosaic techniques, Central Asian textile patterns, Indian mathematical forms, all were absorbed into the developing Islamic artistic tradition and transformed into something new. The great mosques and palaces of the early Islamic world were built by craftsmen of Byzantine and Persian training, using techniques and decorative vocabularies that reflected the entire history of the Silk Road. Chapter 22: The Silk Road and the Food We Eat. The Silk Road changed what humanity eats and drinks in ways so fundamental that we rarely think about them. The foods we consider native to their regions, the tomatoes of Italian cuisine, the chili peppers of Chinese and Korean and Thai cooking, the potatoes of the European diet, are actually the products of the Columbian exchange, the massive transfer of plants and animals between the old and new worlds that followed Columbus's voyages. But before the Columbian exchange, there was the Silk Road exchange, a slower and less dramatic but equally significant transfer of food plants across the old world. Grapes traveled the Silk Road westward from their origin in the Caucasus region, or eastward from there, depending on your perspective, to become one of the most important agricultural crops of both the Mediterranean world and China. The Han Chinese, who first learned of grapes and wine from Zhang Qian's diplomatic missions to Central Asia, began cultivating both. The Persian wine-drinking culture, celebrated in the poetry of Omar Khayyam and 100 other poets, was itself a product of the long history of grape cultivation in the Iranian plateau. Citrus fruits traveled the Silk Road from their origins in South and Southeast Asia. Oranges, both the bitter Seville orange that came first to the Mediterranean and the sweet orange that followed centuries later, came from China and Southeast Asia via the Arab trade routes. The word orange itself comes from Sanskrit, traveling through Persian and Arabic into European languages, carrying in its etymology the whole story of the fruit's westward journey. Sugar, perhaps the most consequential food substance in world history, traveled the Silk Road from its origins in New Guinea and India, where sugarcane had been cultivated for thousands of years. Arab merchants brought sugar to the Mediterranean world in the early medieval period, and its production followed the Arab conquests. Sugar plantations were established in Sicily, in Spain, in the Levant. The medieval European word for sugar, sucre in French, zucchero in Italian, sugar in English, comes from Arabic sukkar, which comes from Persian shakar, which comes from Sanskrit sharkara. Cotton traveled from India westward along the Silk Road, transforming the textile industry of the Islamic world and eventually of Europe. The word cotton comes from Arabic qutan, itself a borrowing from an earlier Semitic word. Before cotton reached Europe via the Arab trade routes, European peasants wore wool and linen. Cotton was a luxury import. After it arrived, it transformed clothing across the entire world. Spices, as we have already discussed, traveled the maritime Silk Road from their origins in South and Southeast Asia, and their westward movement drove both the economic history of the medieval world and the exploratory history of the early modern period. The chili pepper that is now inseparable from Chinese, Indian, Korean, and Thai cooking came from the Americas via the Columbian Exchange. But the taste for spice that made chilies so readily adoptable in Asian cuisines was the product of 1,000 years of Silk Road spice culture. Tea, perhaps the most culturally significant beverage in world history after wine and beer, spread from its origins in China along the Silk Road and the maritime routes to become the national drink of Britain, Russia, Japan, India, and dozens of other cultures. The tea ceremony of Japan, the chai culture of India, the Russian samovar tradition, all derive ultimately from the Chinese cultivation of tea that travelers on the Silk Road encountered and brought home. Chapter 23. The Decline of the Overland Routes. Nothing in history ends simply, and the Silk Road did not end simply. It faded gradually over a century or more, as the conditions that had sustained it were transformed by forces that no one fully controlled. The Portuguese opening of the sea route around Africa to India in the late 15th century was the most important single cause of the overland Silk Road's decline. When Vasco da Gama reached Calicut in 1498, he demonstrated that it was possible to sail directly from Europe to the spice markets of India without going through the Ottoman Empire, without paying duties at a dozen different customs posts, without employing the elaborate chain of commercial intermediaries that had sustained the overland routes for centuries. The sea route was longer in miles but cheaper in cost, because sea transport was far more efficient than land transport for bulk goods. Over the following decades and centuries, more and more of the trade between Asia and Europe shifted from the overland routes to the sea routes. The Ottoman Empire, which controlled the western end of the overland routes, tried to compete, maintaining the Red Sea spice route and taxing the goods that passed through it. But the Portuguese, and then the Dutch and the English, progressively undermined Ottoman commercial power in the Indian Ocean. The great oasis cities of the overland Silk Road felt the shift. Samarkand, which had been one of the richest cities in the world under the Timurids, began to stagnate. Bukhara maintained more of its prosperity because of its local agricultural base, but it too felt the diversion of trade. The Central Asian cities that had been stopping points on the overland route, Merv, Nishapur, Balkh, never recovered from the Mongol destruction and were not rebuilt with the investment that a thriving commercial route would have attracted. The political fragmentation of Central Asia after the end of the Timurid period also contributed. The Uzbek Confederation that displaced the Timurids in the early 16th century was less commercially sophisticated and less culturally open than its predecessors. The Safavid Persian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, the two great powers of the Western Silk Road world in the 16th and 17th centuries, were in persistent conflict, and their conflict disrupted the western section of the overland routes. The development of direct maritime connections between Europe, India, and China, pioneered by the Portuguese, and then expanded by the Dutch and English East India Companies in the 17th century, completed the commercial revolution that ended the overland Silk Road's dominance. By the 18th century, the great bulk of the Asia-Europe trade went by sea. The overland routes continued to operate. They never entirely died, but they carried a fraction of the traffic they had once sustained. The oasis cities did not die, but they shrank. The caravanseries that had once housed hundreds of merchants and thousands of camels fell into disrepair. The great bazaars still operated, but for local rather than international trade. The Silk Road became, gradually, a road of regional commerce rather than a highway of world trade. Chapter 24. The Silk Road in the Modern Imagination. The very phrase Silk Road, Seidenstrasse in the original German, was coined not by a medieval traveler, but by a German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen, who used it in a book published in 1877. He was describing routes that had already been dormant for centuries, reconstructing from historical sources, and his own extensive travels in China, a network of ancient trade routes that had once connected the world. Richthofen's phrase caught on immediately, because it captured something that people sensed to be true, that there had been connections between East and West in the ancient and medieval world that modern people had forgotten, connections that had been important, and that deserved to be remembered and understood. The Silk Road as an idea, as a concept, as a framework for understanding world history, became extraordinarily productive in the century and a half since Richthofen named it. The great archaeologists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries threw themselves into the recovery of the Silk Road's physical remains. Aurel Stein, the British-Hungarian archaeologist who made 4 expeditions to Central Asia between 1900 and 1930, recovered thousands of manuscripts, paintings, and artifacts from the oasis sites of the Silk Road, including the extraordinary cache of manuscripts from the sealed cave at Dunhuang, a cave that had been walled up around 1000 CE and reopened in 1900, preserving thousands of documents in Chinese, Tibetan, Sogdian, Sanskrit, and other languages in perfect condition. The Dunhuang materials are now spread across museums in London, Paris, Beijing, and St. Petersburg, and they constitute one of the most important archives of the ancient world. Other archaeologists followed. Paul Pelliot excavated at Dunhuang and in Central Asia. Sven Hedin mapped the deserts of Central Asia. Albert von Lecoq excavated the oasis cities of Xinjiang. The physical remains of the Silk Road world began to fill the museums of Europe in circumstances that were often controversial. The local communities whose heritage was being removed had little say in the matter, and that continued to generate disputes about repatriation. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the Silk Road has become one of the organizing concepts of world history. The insight that the ancient and medieval world was more connected than it might appear, that goods and ideas and peoples moved across enormous distances, and that these movements were historically significant, has transformed the way historians understand the past. The Silk Road framework has been applied not just to the routes between China and the Mediterranean, but to the entire network of connections that linked the Old World civilizations. The maritime routes of the Indian Ocean, the steppe routes of the Eurasian grasslands, the river routes of the Eurasian interior. China's Belt and Road Initiative, announced in 2013, explicitly invokes the historical Silk Road in its name and its imagery, presenting a program of infrastructure investment across Central Asia, South Asia, Africa, and Europe as a revival of the ancient trade routes. The political use of the Silk Road concept is a reminder of how powerful a historical frame can be. The idea of the Silk Road, that ancient network of connection and exchange, carries an appeal that modern governments want to borrow. Chapter 25. The Caravans and the People Who Traveled Them. We have spoken of empires and armies and great merchants and famous travelers. But the Silk Road was also made by ordinary people. The caravanners, the guides, the interpreters, the oasis innkeepers, the camel drivers, the women who wove silk in Chinese workshops, the farmers who grew the mulberry trees, the monks who illuminated manuscripts in roadside monasteries, the musicians who played for travelers in the caravanserais at night. The caravan was the basic unit of Silk Road travel. Merchants did not travel alone. The dangers were too great, the practical requirements too complex. Instead, they banded together in caravans of tens or hundreds of animals and people, hearing professional caravan leaders who knew the routes and the watering points and the dangers, and traveling in organized groups that provided mutual protection. The Bactrian camel was the primary beast of burden on the Central Asian sections of the route, as we have noted. A large caravan might include hundreds of camels, each carrying its load of silk or spices or metalwork. The camels walked slowly, perhaps 30 or 40 kilometers a day, but they walked reliably, day after day, through terrain that would have defeated any other pack animal. The caravanserai was the essential infrastructure of Silk Road travel. These were large walled inns, spaced roughly a day's journey apart along the main routes, where caravans could stop for the night in relative safety, unload the animals, feed and water them, sleep in the shelter of the walls, cook food, repair equipment, and begin the next day's journey refreshed. A good caravanserai had a well, a bazaar where food and supplies could be bought, stabling for animals, and rooms or dormitories for the merchants. The great caravanserais of the Silk Road world were more than inns. They were places of commercial exchange, where merchants from different places and different trading networks could meet and do business. They were places of cultural exchange, where stories and news and songs and religious ideas traveled along with the goods. A merchant sitting in a caravanserai in Merv might hear news of events in China and Constantinople in the same evening. A monk stopping for the night might share a meal with a Muslim trader and a Zoroastrian firekeeper. The caravanserai was a microcosm of the Silk Road's cosmopolitan world. The ordinary Silk Road traveler's life was hard. The desert crossings could take weeks, with water rationed carefully and the ever-present danger of sandstorms that could disorient and kill. The mountain passes were cold and dangerous, with ice-covered trails and the ever-present risk of avalanche. Bandits preyed on caravans, particularly in periods when imperial authority was weak. Disease was constant. Travelers from different